Where are we?
Right now you're in a kind of a limbo. You're neither here nor there.
Where exactly am I?
Between light and shadow.
Hey gang, welcome to Between Light and Shadow, a Twilight Zone podcast. I'm Craig, and like many of you, I'm kinda basking in the glow of the Twilight Zone's 60th anniversary, which is this coming Wednesday, October 2nd, 2019. I considered doing some kind of all-out celebration episode, but as I thought about it, I couldn't really come up with anything to do. I mean, I could gush for an hour about the show and what it's meant to me, but I kind of already been doing that on this podcast for the last 3 years. Now, of course, the big event that everyone's talking about is Serling Fest in Binghamton, New York, this coming weekend. Almost everyone will be there. Mark DeWidziak, Arlen Schumer, Nick Parisi, Amy Boyle Johnston, Tom Elliott, even our own TZ music guru herself, Dr. Reba Wisner, will be there. And all of them will be doing presentations or hosting panels. It's a 3-day Rod Serling / Twilight Zone celebration for the ages. And I won't be there. I'm not gonna lie, it's been a tough couple of months seeing all the lead-up stuff, knowing that I wasn't going to be a part of it. And I don't mean doing any kind of presentation or anything like that, like Tom and Reba are doing. I just mean being there and experiencing it and meeting all these people whose work I greatly admire. Why am I not going, you ask? It's my daughter Kendall's fault. Okay, fault's the wrong word. Her mom and I just dropped her off this last weekend at college, which means for the first time ever, we're empty nesters. And it's a big change. There's a lot of emotions flying around the house right now. And it didn't feel right for me to up and leave Teresa all alone the very next weekend. So why couldn't I come and just bring her along, you ask? Yeah, she's not into it. So, if you're going to Serling Fest, and if you're a fan of this show, and you find yourself wishing that I was there, maybe doing a live episode or something like Tom is doing, well, you can blame the wife and kid. But you know, the 60th anniversary lasts for the next year, and maybe the best way to celebrate it is to just keep this show going and honor Serling's legacy in the same way we always have. So we're going to do just that. But this week, I still want to do something special. Enter comic artist Koren Shadmi, whose graphic novel The Twilight Man, Rod Serling, and the Birth of Television will be released next week. Koren was kind enough to carve a half hour out of his busy schedule and chat with yours truly about his book. And since by celebrating the Twilight Zone, we're really celebrating Rod Serling, well, this actually feels like a great way to observe the anniversary. Now, I should mention that we did have a few technical issues when we recorded this. The incoming sound wasn't as clear as it should have been, but things were rolling along fine for the first 20 minutes or so, and then Koren's internet connection went out completely. He changed over to his phone, and we were able to resume the chat, but here's the thing. The phone portion actually sounds a lot better. So about 21 and a half minutes into the interview, the sound quality suddenly will improve quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, the rest of it's totally intelligible, but it makes me wonder if simply calling people on the phone via Skype might yield better overall results. It's always a bit of a crapshoot doing long-distance interviews, and we tend to think that a hardwired connection is always preferable. But you know, there are times when the 4G connectivity on my phone is faster than my PC, which is connected directly to the modem. So, I don't know. Something to think about for future chats. But now, without further ado, I present to you my chat with Koren Shadmi. Koren, welcome to Between Light and Shadow.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start by hearing you describe the book. If somebody picks it up with no foreknowledge of what it is, what will they find?
This is a nonfiction graphic novel biography of Rod Serling, the creator of the Twilight Zone, and as well, he also created several important television shows, and he was the writer of Planet of the Apes. So if you are at all curious about who is this man who was behind one of the most lasting and I would say kind of groundbreaking shows in television, this is kind of an easy way to get the story, because what you have out there is mostly these really big these really big books that are just 500 or 600 pages. So a graphic novel is just a lot more digestible.
Sure. One of my favorite things is the framing device that you use. Essentially, without getting too detailed, it's Rod Serling on a plane, and he's talking to another passenger, and he pretty much just ends up kind of reeling off his life story to her. So I think that was really, really clever, because I'm not sure how else you could really do it and still have Rod Serling himself telling that story. So I think it kind of adds a personal element that I personally find really appealing. I got to congratulate you. I think the book is great.
Thank you.
Like
Thank
you
so
just,
much.
yeah, like you said, I mean, you've already got multiple books out there that kind of go over his life, but never in a graphic format like this. And it's really fresh and exciting. And I was actually going to ask you before you said it if graphic novel was the correct term for it, because I've seen you build as a comic artist, but graphic novel sounds more prestigious somehow to me, and it's definitely feels it feels more like more than a comic. I mean, it feels like a book, so I'm just going to call it a book, if that's all right.
Okay, I'm okay with that.
When my copy gets here next week, it's going to go on my bookshelf next to my other Twilight Zone books, so it's a book.
Fantastic. Yeah, graphic novel is actually a term that was coined by Will Eisner in I think in the either 60s or 70s, where he was one of the first people that were going around saying, hey, these things are not just for kids. Let's give it a more respectable term, because comics is a little, it's misleading, and it's too much associated with the funnies that are in the newspapers, or, superhero comics. So he was the one who created it. And it's a little bit of a problematic term, because some people are like, well, they don't think it's the right description for it. I personally don't have an issue with it, but I don't have an issue with me being called a comic book artist or a comics artist. A graphic novel. I don't call myself a graphic novelist, because that just sounds a little pompous. So, yeah.
So we'll just call it a book.
A book, yeah.
Nice
it is
generic
indeed a
middle
book,
term.
and it's
a book.
It's a big one, a big book that has weight and exists in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I really can't wait till mine arrives. I mean, obviously, I've read the electronic version that your publicist provided, but yeah, I can't wait to actually hold it in my hands. I think that's just a different tactile experience, holding a book and looking and flipping through a book and reading it, versus seeing it on a screen, because we see everything on screens. So it's
right.
I really can't wait to actually get it in my hot little hands.
Right.
Now, when I first heard about the book, I knew there was something familiar about your name, and I couldn't place it. So I started looking through your website, and there it was. You did a really amazing portrait of Rod Serling a few years ago. And I don't know, was that maybe kind of like a prelude to this at that time?
Yeah,
was it in your head?
Yeah, definitely. It was, something that happened right after I started watching the show. In the book, I kind of describe how I was exposed to the show late in the game. I'm Israeli, and we didn't really have the Twilight Zone, the original show, in Israel growing up. So I actually only got to see it in my late 20s, and it kind of, or even, I think maybe it was actually like when I just turned 30 or something like that. But it was just mind blowing. I loved it so much, and it felt like just similar to my work, and someone, it seems like Serling had kind of a similar mentality, and I just felt really connected to it. So that was kind of a result of just watching the show. I was like, well, I got to do something right now about it. And I made this print, and people really loved it. And I was like, wow, people really love this guy. Like, and this might have been one of the first kind of, maybe I should do something a little more extensive about it, because it seems like a lot of people still love the Twilight Zone.
Well, I will tell you that I discovered that portrait too late, and I scoured the internet trying to find a print, and I never got one. And
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah, it was a limited edition, so it's unfair of me to make more illegal copies.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it is.
Maybe I'll make a version, a second version for this. We'll see, for the release of the book. It's a good idea.
I will be the first in line to pick that up.
Okay.
I have a spot on the wall already picked out for it. So,
cool.
I'm gonna put a link to your website in the show notes, just so everyone that hears this podcast can look at some of your stuff. I mean, because that Serling portrait is really gorgeous, but there's so much more there. It's really a lot of eye candy, and there's a lot of kind of surrealist elements to a lot of what you do. So I hear what you're saying about, you in discovering the Twilight Zone, you sort of felt some kind of connection between your art and that show. My favorite, I think, piece that I saw on your website was it's an animated GIF of a woman pushing a giant eyeball up a hill.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just stared at that thing for probably 10 minutes. It's very hypnotic, and really calming in a strange sort of way. They could totally, if they ever did like a Twilight Zone animated series, that could totally be part of the opening credit sequence. Just that.
Right. There is a lot of eye imagery there in the Twilight Zone. Yeah.
And that's also a staple of surrealist art. So yeah, I mean, that's a nice kind of through line that I see, going back obviously to Dali, and then forward to the Twilight Zone, and then into a lot of your stuff. So that's really neat.
Yeah, we have we're having an event at the School of Visual Arts this week. That's going to be a screening of 3 episodes of the Twilight Zone, and the episode I picked is Eye of the Beholder, which is kind of a little bit of a cliche choice, but it's just my favorite, and then I make the connection to surrealism in there because you have all these covered faces, and it's very reminiscent of Magritte's work. He has this painting called The Lovers, where it's 2 people kissing with cloth all over their faces. So there's something very, very surreal about the Twilight Zone, and I'm not sure how. I mean, I'm sure Serling was familiar with the movement, and I'm sure some of it is definitely intentional.
Sure. Can you talk a little bit about the technical side of what you do? Do you hand draw the panels on paper, or is this created digitally?
Yeah, it's the only thing that was done on paper is the very rough thumbnails, which are basically the organization of the frame, the frames on the page. After that, it's scanned, and all the stages after that are basically digital. So the rough pencils, the inks, and later the shading was all done digitally. I put in an effort for it to look not too computery. So hopefully it's kind of hard to tell for the reader if it was actually digital or not. yeah, it's basically all digital. It was drawn on a Cintiq, which is basically a big screen where you can draw on. Yeah, and so it's predominantly digital, which, if anyone ever wants to buy original pages, it's going to be a little bit of a pickle for me. So,
sure. But, the fact that I'm asking the question, I think, kind of answers that. You can't tell. I mean, to me, it looks hand drawn. It's and that's one of the things that's appealing to me about it, because, maybe it goes back to more that just that tactile sense of holding a physical book. I'm looking at art, and it looks like it was hand drawn. So there's just sort of a connection, I guess, maybe between the artist and the reader there, where you actually get a sense of the physical effort involved. And I think even if you're drawing it digitally, I mean, that's still physical. You're still moving, a penciled device on a screen. So it's really not that different.
Yeah, and I also pick specific brushes that look, have some texture and are not perfect. And I put in some textures over everything at the end. So it also kind of gives it a more organic look.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that it's monochromatic. Rod Serling should be in black and white. Whenever I see an episode of, say, like Night Gallery, it's just always jarring for me. It's always weird because I just feel like I don't know.
Yeah, and also sometimes I think he really likes to tan. So sometimes you see him in some of his color appearances, and he's kind of red, and I'm like, okay, that's he loves tanning.
Yeah, Serling definitely got a lot of sun. There's lots of pictures of him, laying out by his pool.
He loves it. So,
can you describe your evolution as a comic artist? Like, where did it all start for you?
Well, it started pretty early. I'm from a town called Ra'anana in Israel, and there was a comics course that started in my town, and my mom saw the listing, and she's like, "You want to go, learn how to draw comics?" And I was like, "What's comics?" Because they were really not prominent in Israel. But I was like, okay, I'll give it a go. And I was the youngest kid in the class, and I was very discouraged the first class. I was like, I can't really draw very well. But I kept at it, and I kind of, learned a lot of stuff from the guy who was the teacher, and I ended up being his assistant for several years. So he was kind of my intro to the world of comics. And ever since, I just never really got over this addiction to comics. So and people mention this, that they kind of try to leave it and they always come back. And there's it's a very like the eyeball gift that you saw, it's a very physical art form. It's a lot of work and not a lot of reward, but it's just, there's something about it that's like really great. The fact that you can kind of create almost like a film on paper, and all you need is just time and a pen and pencil.
And that's one of the things that I found really appealing about the book, is that it definitely has a cinematic quality, not necessarily like this larger than life, just like constant, like superhero action kind of cinematic quality that you would see in Marvel comics or whatever. But this is it looks like a movie. And it's funny because I've kind of been waiting forever for somebody to do a Rod Serling biopic. And of course they just announced recently that there's going to be one. Richard Kelly is directing. But as I was reading your book, what I was realizing is this is essentially what I've always wanted to see. Just kind of a straight kind of chronological adaptation, some deviations into different things, but really just, the true story. And I really, again, love that device of having Serling himself telling that story. he was first and foremost a writer, but we're probably always going to remember him more as an on-screen presence, like a narrator. And
Right.
in your book, he's kind of doing the ultimate narration, his own life. And
Right.
I hear his head in my voice, or his voice in my head as I'm reading it, which is amazing. I mean, that's just that, as a Serling fan, isn't an experience in and of itself, just reading this thing and hearing him speaking. So I think that you really captured that really, really well.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping to. It's a tall order to try and kind of write or speak in Sterling's voice, because he was a very, very smart, well-read guy who could really really generate these beautiful literary monologues. And I tried my best to kind of use some of the words that he loves, like that he kept repeating, like predicament or particular. He loved that word. So I watched a bunch of the episodes, as I was working on the book, and I was like, well, I got to put some of this kind of Sterling-esque wording in there. But it is difficult to live up to that, and I'm glad that you felt like it did sound like his voice, because it's a very difficult voice to kind of, you can kind of spoof it, but if you're like honestly trying to kind of mirror some of his work, that's fairly difficult. And I was just listening the other day just to the intro of the Twilight Zone, and it's just so perfect. Just it's not that many words, but they're just so well placed and put together that it kind of sets the tone to the show, and that was part of his genius, I think.
Right. Can you? So as far as your process goes, did you like type up a full script and then adapt it visually, or do you just operate off of notes? How does that go?
Yeah, I definitely did create a script, which helped a lot because there's so much to his life, and I couldn't put everything in there. So a lot of what I did was kind of basically get rid of the things that maybe weren't as crucial, and a lot of editing. Editing down of his life story. And, one of the earlier drafts, the military part was even bigger. And I was like, well, I have to kind of shrink that part. But yeah, I wrote it as a script, and then went on from there. So really, I had to kind of hammer out all the kinks, and there wasn't much changed, from the script to the actual, book. The editor wanted maybe like one or two extra kind of visual pages to show his struggles with the network. So I kind of added that. But other than that, I was pretty loyal to the script that I wrote.
I loved the page where Serling is starting to come up against a lot of network censorship, and you kind of present that or depict that as a boxing match. And he's fighting this really like enormous guy with a TV for a head, and I just thought that was genius. I think that may be my favorite page in the whole book. I was just
thank you. Yeah, that was the page, one of the pages we added, one or two, and really, when you kind of sum up one of the things of the book, it's that he was always fighting. He was always fighting against something, and and fighting for his ability to put out his work honestly and without being censored or without being changed. And I think that battle was kind of very difficult and wore him down a little bit. But I tried to show that he was kind of infatuated with boxing, with these kind of very macho 1950s things, Ernest Hemingway and all that kind of stuff. So he was a boxer in the army too, and that's part of it, kind of to prove prove that despite being like this tiny guy, he's a force to be reckoned with.
And I think that's probably why, because he wasn't real big, so I think that's probably why he was
5'3",
yeah. But no, I thought that was just a brilliant touch as far as just kind of pulling in the different kind of phases of his life. And it really presents kind of a consistent sort of story. He's in the army and he's boxing, and then you just bring that forward. I love that. Then obviously he wrote some really significant things about boxing. So going back a little bit to the surrealism stuff, I looked through your website before I saw the book. So I wondered like what to expect, because there's a lot of fascinating surreal imagery in your art. One of the things that I found I really liked about your book was that you actually employed a lot of restraint, because I think a lot of people think of the Twilight Zone as just being extraordinarily weird. Like the weirder it is, the more Twilight Zone it is, which is not correct, but I can see how people would think that. So it probably would have been really easy for you to just go crazy with the visuals, full on Salvador Dali, German expressionism kind of stuff. And I think maybe that would have been appropriate had your book just been about the Twilight Zone era of Serling's life. But since you're covering his entire adult life, I think the subtle visual approach is entirely appropriate. So I wanted to commend you on that.
So, yes, I think that, he had a very dramatic and interesting life story, and most of it was not the Twilight Zone. It was actually, all these other seminal accomplishments and his army service. So really, I thought that like you said, using the Twilight Zone as a lens for all of it would be just wouldn't be right. If really I was doing a graphic novel just about the Twilight Zone, then sure. But and there's a kind of a level of realism to it too, because a lot of what he experienced in the army was very real and very terrifying. So I didn't want it to feel like some sort of hallucination.
Yeah. No, I think that was entirely appropriate. And kind of in tandem with that, one of the other things I really appreciated was you kept it real, because Rod Serling was, just like everyone, a flawed individual with very real insecurities and weaknesses and trauma in his own life. And he wasn't a perfect guy. And you capture all of that without casting an undue shadow over him. Did you ever feel throughout the initial writing or at any point that maybe you should, I don't know, gloss over any of that?
Yeah, well, there's a few biographies of Serling, and one of them is a very good biography, but also kind of dives very deep into what's the word? All the negative stuff in his life, and kind of talks about all his misgivings and his issues, and I didn't want to just serve you like a glossy image of Serling, because that wouldn't be right. But I also didn't want it to be some sort of smear piece where it's just like, well, this guy, you thought he was great, but he was actually, this pathetic, So there's two sides to him. He was very contradictory person, and on one end he was extremely talented and extremely accomplished and became successful really young, and on the other hand he was very insecure about his work and never thought it was good enough, and he thought that television was kind of not. I'm sure he was conflicted about it, but sometimes I think he felt that television was not a worthy medium. And a lot of the other guys that started with him in television, like Gore Vidal, they became these esteemed writers. And I think that that was one thing he kind of wanted to do and never really got to.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, he had his issues, and I don't go too much into it, but yeah, I wanted to present that he, had his own struggles and his own demons, and he was definitely like very, very traumatized by his war service, and that in a sense also affected the Twilight Zone. It wouldn't be the show that it is if he didn't have to see all that death and experience all that trauma.
Right. Yeah. So here's my big idea.
Okay.
If you've already written this, you started out with a script. You just tweak it as a screenplay, and you send it over to Richard Kelly. You just say,
yeah.
Here you go. Here's your movie right here.
Someone actually this week inquired about the film rights for the graphic novel. So
really,
we'll see it. Yeah,
Ooh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Like
I said.
And then, yeah, I mean, it's, you don't make much money in comics. So whenever someone's like, we might option your book, you're always like, I need rent money. But with Hollywood, a lot of times it's just like, they kind of, they put a little carrot in front of you and then disappears the next day.
Sure.
So we'll see.
No, like I said, I think the book, just a straight adaptation, would be amazing. So that's my hope. That's what I'm hoping to see. So I don't want to spoil the ending for anybody. I mean, obviously, Serling dies at the end, but that's not quite the end.
He's revived as an android and lives on an asteroid. Yeah.
Okay, if you're going to spoil it, fine, but I wasn't going to. But so obviously he's going to die. But that's not quite the end of the story, and I was amazed by that last page. I found it so immensely satisfying, and it was so fitting.
Thank you.
It's a very Twilight Zone ending, and again, very cinematic as well. It's eerie. It's mysterious, and I loved it. And again, I want to see that in a film.
Thank you. Yeah. Hopefully.
Do you have any other upcoming stuff that you can talk about?
Yes, there's a book that will be coming out, I believe sometime next year. That is called A for Anonymous. It's a graphic novel that I did together with David Kushner, who's a tech and gaming writer.
Okay.
And we've collaborated before on the biography of Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. So this new book is basically the story of Anonymous, the hacker group. So the hacker collective. So hopefully that one is favorable too, because I don't want to be like doxxed and hacked or whatever. but yeah, it's a very different book than the Serling book, because it doesn't tell the story of one person. It's rather like this movement. So, but it's also a nonfiction. So that's coming up.
Cool. And where can listeners find you?
Listeners can find me at KorenShadmi.com or at my Instagram, Koren Shadmi, Twitter, the same thing. It's all the same handle.
And I'm going to put links to all those in the show notes. So the book is The Twilight Man, Rod Serling, and the Birth of Television. Listeners can get their very own copies on October 8th, wherever fine books are sold. Koren Shadmi, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. And again, congratulations on the book. I think it's really something special.
Great. Thank you for having me. And thank you for reading the book and enjoying it.
I'm highly enjoying it. It's
really
great. All right. Thanks very much. I should mention that Koren's book is being released by Humanoids under their Life-Drawn imprint, and that New York School of Visual Artists event that he mentioned is Masks, Mannequins, and Monsters, a Twilight Zone tribute, on October 3rd, the day before Serling Fest kicks off. Koren will be joined by Arlen Schumer, author of Visions from the Twilight Zone, and Nick Parisi, author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. Each of them will screen and discuss a favorite episode. As we heard, Koren's is Eye of the Beholder. I'm betting Arlen is presenting The After Hours, and I'm not sure which one Nick's doing. Damn, I wish I could go to that. I guess if I could also go to Serling Fest. Man, between my youngest leaving the nest and missing all these festivities, I'm gonna need a drink. I'm gonna need to drink like a lot, like more than usual. Like as soon as I'm done recording this. So we're on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Between Light and Shadow or @ZonePod and you'll find us. Or drop us an email, zonepod@gmail.com. Now listen, hit Amazon or barnesandnoble.com right now and pre-order Koren Shadmi's The Twilight Man. Like right now, go do it. You will not be sorry. Next up, we'll be resuming our SOP. It's Standard Operating Procedure, or Standard Operating Podcast, maybe. You know the MO. We take an episode from the first season of The Twilight Zone and compare/contrast it with an episode from later in the series, one that shares some sort of significant similarity. First up, 2 Flights of Time Travel Fancy.
What's today's date?
March the 5th.
What year?
1917.
It's March the 5th, 1959, Lieutenant.
Somehow, this aircraft has gone back into time.
Now, normally we're a bi-weekly show, now that we're back, but I'm not gonna make y'all wait 2 weeks. Come back this Sunday. Till then, kids, play nice.
Between light and shadow.